Going abroad to learn Chinese in an immersion environment can be great, but unless you plan to stay for years, you might be better off delaying your trip. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about going abroad to learn Chinese in an immersion environment. And while this is widely regarded to be beneficial for your language development, in this week's episode, I'm going to argue that going right now might be a mistake and that delaying your trip can be even more beneficial in certain situations. As mentioned, learning Chinese in an immersion environment is beneficial for many reasons, but it's not the silver bullet that many people believe it to be. Motivation is one of the most important benefits of learning Chinese abroad. You have an immediate need to communicate with people around you, and that is a very powerful motivation to learn more. Another important benefit is access to the language and resources to learn it. Because while you can of course find Chinese-speaking people all over the world, it's certainly easier to find them in China. You're also surrounded by Chinese every day, hence the word immersion, and you can read it on billboards, on signs, etc., and you can hear Chinese being spoken everywhere around you. And here we start to see why language immersion might not be equally helpful for all students. Just because you're surrounded by the language doesn't mean that you will learn much if you don't engage with it, and there are several reasons you might not do this. For example, if you're busy with other things that are not in Chinese, you don't have much time and energy to focus on learning Chinese. Or if you are a beginner and you don't know any characters, you will not benefit much from seeing them even if they are all around you. Sure, if you do this long enough, you might figure out what some very simple characters mean, but this is terribly ineffective compared to learning about characters in a textbook or a course that somebody has created specifically for you as an adult learner. The same is true for spoken Mandarin, at least up to a point. So if you, as a beginner, sit on the bus and you listen to 3 native speakers speak Chinese among themselves, it's likely that you will not understand anything. Sure, you might be able to figure out some things if you listen for long enough and if there are clear enough references, such if somebody's repeatedly pointing to something and using a specific word. But again, this is terribly inefficient compared to just learning the word directly or learning it in an environment that was designed for you as a learner. So language immersion is not magic. It will help you in some ways, but if you don't know any Chinese, you will not be able to use most of the opportunities to engage with the language that the environment offers. Still, most people recommend students to go abroad to learn a language, and I'm not an exception. The question I want to explore here is when to go, and we can ignore unhelpful answers such as 5 years ago, but then I think a common answer to this question is right now or go as soon as you can, but I think this is only true in a small number of cases. This argument relies on the assumption that you are not willing to relocate abroad for many years, because then I think you should just do it as early as possible if learning Chinese is the only thing you care about. For most people, this is not possible or practical, or perhaps not even desirable, and most students maybe want to go abroad for a week, or a few months, or maybe a year, and then it matters when you go. You will benefit much more from immersion if you already know some Chinese, so if you're a zero beginner or just a beginner in general, you might be better off delaying your trip and simply learn more Chinese at home before you go. Remember, I'm not saying that learning Chinese at home here is better. I'm just saying that if you can go to China for, say, 1 semester, it makes much more sense to do so after you've studied 1 semester at home, rather than doing the opposite, so going to China for 1 semester and then going home to keep studying on your own. I'm fully convinced that the first case will lead to much better results than the second. So let's have a look at why this is the case. First, if you go to China without knowing anything at all, you will spend most of your time there learning basic things you might as well have learned at home. Learning a language as a beginner requires you to learn a few hundred words, how the basic sound system works, and maybe a few things about characters if you also want to be able to read and write, and these things can be equally well learned at home. I would even argue that it's easier to learn them in your home country compared to in China. Which brings us up to number 2. If your beginner course is taught entirely in Chinese, you might misunderstand, miss or overlook important information. Normally, the more Chinese that's spoken in a lesson, the better, but as a pure beginner, there are some things that are rather nice to know about and which will be very hard to convey to you as a beginner in Chinese. I'm talking about some basic things about how the language works and how to learn it, maybe what tones are, the basics of Chinese characters, and things like that. Some teachers will of course speak English, but in many schools there are also many other students who might not speak English, and so Chinese will be the dominant language, which, as I said, in most cases is a good thing, but it's not a good thing in all cases, especially if you're completely new to the language. The third reason I want to explore is that immersion becomes more useful the more you understand, and is therefore mostly wasted if you understand nothing. This is related to what I said earlier about eavesdropping on native speakers on the bus. It can be extremely beneficial if you're an intermediate student and you can understand and follow what they're talking about and thereby learn something by listening to them. But if you know no Chinese or understand nothing of what they say, you can't really learn anything about the words and the grammar that they use and how they use it and so on. You can only maybe learn something about prosody and what Chinese sounds like, but that's about it. This argument can be applied to speaking as well, although the case there is a little bit more limited, I think. When you know how to say almost nothing in a language, you benefit greatly from speaking to anyone at all, or even to yourself or to an AI chatbot or something. But once you're no longer a pure beginner, you will start benefiting much more from talking with other people, employing communicative strategies when you talk to them, surviving different types of communication and conversations in different contexts, and so on. And then immersion is great. So remember, I'm not claiming that going abroad is a bad idea and that language immersion doesn't work. I'm just saying that if you have a limited amount of time to spend abroad, which is the case for a vast majority of students, you should wait until you've learned the basics at home. Exactly what that means in practical terms, is that a week, is that a month or a semester? I don't know, it depends a little bit on what your ambitions are for learning Chinese, but I think the more you know before you go, the better. This shouldn't be used as an excuse to not go at all or postpone it indefinitely, but knowing a few hundred words, having some idea of how the sound system works, maybe a few things about Chinese characters if you're interested in that, can be very, very useful. Personally, I studied 1 year almost full-time in Sweden before I went to Taiwan to study in an immersion environment, and that turned out pretty well for me, even though I'm sure I could have gone much earlier too. If you're interested in the story of how I learned Chinese, I'll put links to those episodes in the show notes. I think it's worth comparing with other languages here because you might have different experiences learning languages other than Chinese, or you might have heard about people who say went to South America to learn Spanish or maybe to France to learn French. I think that the arguments that I've made so far in this episode are still relevant for learning languages that are much more closely related to your native language than Chinese is, but much less so. As discussed earlier, one of the main reasons that immersion is beneficial is because it gives you so many opportunities to engage with the language, but then again, as I said, if you don't understand anything, you are not really making use of these opportunities. This is still true for an English-speaking person learning French in France, but it's much less true than if the same person went to China to learn Chinese. The reason is that both listening and reading comprehension are vastly easier in French for somebody who already speaks English. There are many reasons for this, but the large overlap in vocabulary is one of the main ones. I mean, according to some estimates, as much as 50% of English vocabulary comes from French, and then when you go and learn French, you will recognize words almost immediately, even if you have no background studying French at all. Something similar happens when Swedish people learn German or vice versa. Being Swedish, I've seen many Germans who move to Sweden, maybe to study, and who basically speak fluent Swedish after 6 months. And this is because the vocabulary overlap is even bigger than it is between French and English, and there are many other similarities as well. In practice, what this means is that when you're listening to that conversation on the bus or just reading something you see outside when you are in this immersion environment, you will understand what it says to a much higher degree than you will in China. Because like I said, if you don't know any Chinese characters and you see a sign in Chinese, you will understand literally nothing. Whereas if I, as a Swedish person, go to Germany and start reading signs, I will actually understand what some of these signs mean without ever having studied German. The same thing is partly true for the spoken language as well, so the more I expose myself to German, the more I would learn, because I do understand something of what's going on and I can use what I understand to learn more. And the rule here is that the more you understand, the more likely you are to be able to learn the things you didn't understand. And so it follows that if you understand nothing, you will stand almost no chance of learning anything, whereas if you understand most things, it's very likely that you will pick something up from listening to a conversation or maybe reading a text. I've talked more about the difficulty of listening comprehension in a separate episode, and I'll link to it in the show notes. When it comes to learning Chinese in an immersion environment as a beginner, there are many traps and pitfalls that you should be aware of, and many of these you can of course compensate for by going online to look what other people have said about them and, for example, listening to my podcast. This is in fact why Hacking Chinese was launched in the first place, because I was studying in an immersion environment and I figured there were many things that weren't explained or that I wanted to know the answer to, but my courses didn't really teach, and so I looked them up myself or learned on my own, and then I started writing about my experience. More than a decade later, I also put all this into one course called Unlocking Chinese, the Ultimate Guide for Beginners, which essentially is an attempt to cover everything that you do really need to know as a beginner, but which is unlikely that you will pick up automatically just by going to class. And this is true regardless if you study in China or if you study in your home country. For more information about the course, please check the show notes. It's time to wrap up this episode, but before I do that, I'd like to ask your opinion. Have you learned Chinese abroad? What was your experience like? Where did you go, and how much Chinese had you studied before you left? And if you had a time machine and could change when you went abroad to learn Chinese, would you have done so? And what do you think is the best advice to offer to other people in a similar situation? Please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.